Business Law lecture here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, sponsored by the Center for Business Law and Regulation. My name is Professor Jonathan Adler, and I direct the center here. The center was founded in 2003 to address the challenges presented by the changing business environment and to help prepare lawyers here at the law school and in the broader community to deal with these emerging challenges through a range of curricular and extracurricular programs, including this lecture, which is in many ways our keystone program that we offer every year. This lecture was established in 2002 with a generous gift from the Ferry Family Foundation to honor the late Lindsay Cowan, who served as both a professor and dean here at the law school from 1972 through 1982. And under Dean Cowan's leadership, the law school grew both in endowment and its reputation. And this lecture is part of our tribute to what he brought to this school and to the community. And today it's a particular honor and pleasure to introduce this year's lecturer, Commissioner William Kovacic of the Federal Trade Commission. Commissioner Kovacic is on leave from George Washington University School of Law, where he has been a professor of law since 1999. He's been a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission since January of 2006 and was chairman for a year from 2008 to 2009. He had also previously served as general counsel to the Federal Trade Commission from 2001 to 2004. Both at George Washington University and at George Mason University School of Law, he's taught courses in antitrust, contracts, law and economics, government contracts, comparative government procurement, and other courses. He received his AB from Princeton University and a JD from Columbia, and clerked for the Honorable Roselle Thompson, District Court Judge in Maryland. He is a widely cited and published expert on antitrust law, and quite literally has been an expert advisor or consultant on antitrust and consumer protection issues to foreign governments from A to Z. And I mean that literally, because among the over 12 countries for whom he's consulted are Armenia and Zimbabwe. But you didn't come here to listen to me. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Commissioner Kovacic.
I'm extremely grateful to Dean Rawson and the community at Case, to John Adler, whom all of us at George Mason years ago knew would be a rising star, and it's nice to look up in the constellation and see that you not only rose, but you got there without a doubt and continue to shine. And I'm also delighted to be joined here by my colleagues from the Mideast Regional Office of the Federal Trade Commission, headquartered here in Cleveland. John Steiger, who heads the office, and his colleagues who played such a role in placing the FTC in the front ranks of agencies in the fields in which we work and in the larger framework of public administration. I want to start by going back almost 40 years. It's the fall of 1970 when I first stepped onto that college campus that John mentioned before and walked into my first economics course. The instructor whom I had for the course had been a PhD student of Robert Heilbroner, the economist who wrote extensively about development. And one of Heilbroner's principal texts in the field of development economics is The Great Ascent, which was published in the early 1960s. Heilbroner has a concluding chapter in which he lays out what he thinks to be the best possible path for economic development and political liberalization in what was then called the Third World. And he has a fairly emphatic recommendation in the text in which he says that Western notions of market-based economic growth and political liberalism will only be the province for the rest of our lifetimes in a handful of Western countries in North America, in Europe, and a small number of countries in Asia. And that it's time for people in these countries to accept the inevitability that for the rest of our lifetimes, the only effective path of growth will be totalitarian political structures and highly centralized, controlled economic systems that go with them. Now, he said for the rest of our lifetimes, that's a bit of a hedge. Don't quite know how long that's going to be, but he lived on for a good while. And my instructor, who was quite fond of Heilbroner, had a question worth 1/4 of the final exam grade, and here it is. Identify the most promising path for economic growth for the remainder of this century in the Third World. I wonder what would have happened in that classroom in 1970 if I'd said, let's see, by the end of the century, the Soviet Union is going to unravel. And its former republics, to a one, will rely heavily on market-based systems to provide economic growth. What's now known as the Warsaw Pact won't exist anymore. And when you walk through the airports in places like Prague and Warsaw, you will see the blue flag with the gold stars of the European Union, because they will be members, along with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Slovenia of the former Yugoslavia. Let's see, the People's Republic of China will be in the process of preparing their own anti-monopoly law, because they too will be relying heavily on market processes. And by the way, we will have an embassy in Hanoi where there will be the staging grounds for the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission to assist in the development of competition laws in Vietnam. And there will be a tiny handful of countries that will have nothing to do with market-based economic reform. If I'd answered that way, I think I would still be taking that course. Because if you get a 0 on 1/4 of the course, it is likely that you do not pass, and you get to do it again. So what did I do? I did the sensible thing. I told him exactly what he wanted to hear. And I said the only sensible path, of course, was to rely on highly centralized government control of the economy and totalitarian political structures. That was the path for the rest of the century. What's actually happened is one of the most remarkable stories of our lifetime. To think, for example, of the vision of Monet and Schumann in the early 1950s, recognizing that what happened in Germany and France, the total destruction of Europe, could not happen again. That there had to be significant economic integration as a means to achieve political stability and peace in the region. And the active faith of saying through the Coal and Steel Treaty, which leads to the formation of the European Union, that the day will come in which there will be a larger integrated political and economic system there. And again, on a rainy day, to think of how that happened, to think of how in so many parts of the world that process of healing, economic development, and political liberalization has taken place is a very good story to think about on a rainy day, and about what a large measure of goodwill and effort can accomplish. Part of that has involved the development of competition policy. And in the past 50 years, we've gone from a circumstance in which in 1960, for example, competition policy was literally the concern of a tiny handful of countries. If you were a practitioner in 1960, what did you really have to study? You had to study the laws of the United States, and you might spend a little bit of time looking at Germany. But you could forget the rest. Nothing else mattered. To come forward to today as part of this extraordinary process of change, over 105 countries have, literally from A to Z, competition laws. And there are another 15 to 20 in the queue, such that by the end of the decade ahead of us, there will be 120, 130 countries with competition laws and active enforcement regimes. This raises 3 questions related to the competition policy system, and a 4th related to the system of law more generally. In the face of this kind of multiplicity, different cultures, different legal commands, different economic circumstances, different motivations for the implementation of the law, where are we going to find the superior norms that might provide focal points for convergence by individual regimes? How are we going to promote the acceptance of these norms? And what is the role of the United States, which did not invent activity in this area, but certainly, following second after Canada in enacting these laws in the end of the 19th century, was certainly the forerunner in their actual implementation? And what are the lessons of the experience in competition law for other fields of economic regulatory practice globally, be it securities, be it tax, environmental policy, any number of other areas? What I'd like to do is to start by talking about the development of this system of multiplicity internationally, to give you a sense of what's taken place and what it means, to talk about how a competition system is designed and who is setting standards, some propositions about how much convergence we want, that is, in the development of new systems globally, and then to suggest how this might take place in a way that accounts for the benefits of decentralized experimentation, but also achieves some measure of standardization globally, and what role the United States has to play in this process. A little bit of history about the field, and this is really a journey from monopoly to multiplicity. And what was the period of monopoly? And I take here the period from the adoption of the Sherman Act in the United States in 1890 to 1970. And in that period, you had other participants in the process. My agency was one of them. But there was only one institution that really mattered in this field, and it was the Department of Justice. Yes, the Federal Trade Commission had been a participant in the area since 1914, but as one fairly damning blue ribbon report after another documented, in this first period of the Commission's experience, that had been a period of almost unrelieved failure. So much so that in 1969 and 1970, relatively famous blue ribbon studies, one published by Ralph Nader, another by the American Bar Association, the first more florid and flamboyant, the second more sober-minded, came to the same conclusion. One last chance before we put it out of its misery and start all over again. State governments had competition laws in the late 19th century, early 20th century, actively applied. But roughly from 1910 up through the early 1970s, those laws were also dormant, so much that Jim Rawle, the commentator at Northwestern University, the dean of that law school for many years, said that a practitioner could not be prosecuted for malpractice if he simply told his clients to ignore the state laws because they had no actual practical effect. So the Department of Justice in this period is the dominant firm, but that comes to an end. Roughly in the following 40 years, there's domestic entry by new firms and there is expansion by existing firms. What happens to the FTC? It goes from being a heavily castigated, mocked, and scorned institution to one that the Global Competition Review, which uses an admittedly non-scientific process of assessment, ranks the FTC and has for the past 3 years as one of the world's 3 best in an elite 5-star category. Sectoral regulators become more active in areas such as energy and telecommunications. State governments, beginning in the 1970s, begin to dramatically expand their presence in a number of states, Ohio being one of them, and private enforcement becomes a truly significant element of the enforcement process. And roughly from 1989 onward, that's the year that the European Union adopts its first merger regulation to the present. There's a tremendous foreign growth and expansion, and not just by sheer numbers, but by influence. The European Union today is every bit as significant as the United States competition agencies in setting policy globally, an extremely important development over time, and a major ongoing institutional transformation through which the leadership of the EU's Competition Directorate is seeking to establish the infrastructure to ensure that it continues to be the state-of-the-art competition authority over time. How does the dominant firm react to this? Not happily. Dominance is a nice condition to have. When you are dominant, when you are the unmistaken adult in the area, the little children look up to you and say, yes, and they do so adoringly. But what happens when they enter the period of adolescence? They start to ask questions such as why, and then even worse, they start to say no. And there are disagreements. And this is unsettling if, as an institution, you have become accustomed to an unrelieved period of absolute and unquestioned preeminence in the field. And to extend it more broadly, if North Americans, citizens of the United States, and members of its own competition policy family look at these developments, there could perhaps be a certain measure of reluctance about how this has taken place, because given these other transformations, especially in the European Union, but in any number of other countries, the sort of unmistakable lead and absolute preeminence in policy development is gone. And the U.S. agencies are in a position of having to run for their life by superior performance to show that in some sense they are at the head of the pack. What arises in this process? Well, it means that because of developments that continue to take place, revolutionary developments that have antecedents going back to the period of the development of the Sherman Act. It's a modern conceit to think that we're seeing things that have no precedence. Well, the development of the communications technology of the late 19th century, the transport revolution that was taking place, had exactly the same unsettling and transformative developments in that period of the global experience and our national experience as their parallels today did as well. I suppose what's different today is the relative pace and extent of these developments. Not that they have no antecedents, but things in this sense have provided greater degrees of economic integration, greater degrees of interdependence as a result, and it means that the significant antitrust regime, and by significant I mean one whose legal commands have to be taken seriously and have to be incorporated as a basis for decision making throughout the firm's activities globally, the most significant stringent regime now sets policy for the globe. Whether it's for merger policy, especially for monopolization, what Europeans call abusive dominance, that's how the standards are set because no significant business enterprise can afford to ignore what takes place in that jurisdiction. And at the moment, the jurisdictions that have the power to shape standards that way are the United States and the European Union, but it won't be long around the corner before India, China, and any number of others are added to that cohort. That is the number of what I call significant regimes because they have the capacity to establish global standards could number as many as 5 to 10 in a relatively short period of time. This poses tremendous challenges to business decision makers who've come to learn what it's like to do a pre-merger filing in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the farthest reaches of Latin America, throughout the Pacific, and to deal, depending upon the scope of the transaction, with perhaps as many as 70 different pre-merger notification regimes. And where there are unnecessary dissimilarities across systems, this becomes extremely costly and difficult for firms that must comply with this framework. So why care about this development? Well, we globally have a stake in how these international standards are set, and business enterprises have a great stake in the costs associated with how this system operates, and as a normative proposition, to achieve the same or better substantive results at lower costs of compliance and administration is a desirable goal. When we think about what the competition system in any one country consists of, there are really two elements, and you can use basically a computer services metaphor to think about it. There are two elements. There's an operating system that consists mainly of implementing institutions, and then there are applications, which are basically the analytical tools used to carry out routine substantive analytical tasks. The European Union today and for the foreseeable future will be the main source of the operating system. Why is that? Most jurisdictions, with relatively few exceptions, have civil law systems. That's the basic foundation for policymaking in the European Union. A system of administrative policy elaboration subject to judicial review, relatively infrequent use of criminal sanctions and enforcement, with an expert administrative body being the basic vehicle for enforcement and decision making. The U.S. doesn't have that. Yes, the Federal Trade Commission resembles in some ways that model. But the judicial model of enforcement, with the prosecutor going into the federal courts to do something that's significant, is the dominant regime. Imagine in the United States what life would be like if the FTC had the powers of the European Union's Directorate for Competition. Imagine what would happen if the FTC, by its own decision, had the capacity to stop a deal in its tracks, to forbid it, and then to allow the parties to overturn its decision only by going through a process of appellate review. Our lives would be much different. The U.S. agencies cannot do that unless they first get a third party, namely a federal district judge, to basically stop the action. Because the European Union regime has a framework of implementing institutions that is most familiar with and compatible to most countries in the world, that's going to be the dominant operating system. The real competition is going to be in writing applications that run on that system. Applications that consist of merger guidelines. Applications that consist of guidelines for licensing intellectual property. And any number of other analytical techniques that affect how the operating system runs. Now, to some extent, the Europeans and others are now thinking about changing key features of their operating system, adopting criminal enforcement in some instances, expanding private rights of action, but what they're finding is those, what might be called applications, maybe they're part of the operating system, don't run well on their operating system, and the absorption of them is going to be relatively difficult. But it's in the last line where the real sources of influence for purposes of policy administration will take place. This is where the mostly friendly rivalry is going to occur. It's going to be in designing the analytical framework and implementing techniques through which policy is made, and by developing superior approaches for management and operations. Not just the question of what an agency should do, but how it should do it. Who makes the applications? Many high-quality sources around the globe today. One dimension of policymaking now is that there is an ever stronger pool of international talent. Before the sun goes down in the global circuit today, in rooms like this, in academic institutions of this kind, in places like Toulouse, East Anglia, London, Singapore, Delhi, Canberra, Melbourne, Santiago, Chile, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, any number of others, really smart kids and really smart faculty members who are just as smart and just as capable as the wonderful students and faculty who come to this institution and others in North America, they will be studying this same subject. And what happens as these jurisdictions get a little more experience, to put them more on a par of the US, they're studying the same texts, they're reading the same articles, they're just as good as North Americans are. I have 4 advisors in my office who take care of me. One's born in Kazakhstan, the other's born in South Africa. The pool from which one draws today to do work in this field is increasingly global. And more competition agencies post notices for their key appointments in places like The Economist. It's a global recruitment process, and no jurisdiction can sit back and assume just because it's old, it's good anymore. This is a continuing process of redevelopment, regeneration, and the analytical techniques in many jurisdictions around the world are absolutely first-rate. The European Union's guidelines on vertical mergers are the best of their kind in the world. The US continues to develop what I'd say path-breaking, first-rate products in the store of international competition policy applications, leniency for cartels, detection being one of them. But the same is true for management. That is, which jurisdictions have achieved the greatest success in building management methods that assist in identifying priorities and applying them. There's none better in the world today than the United Kingdom's Office of Fair Trading and its Competition Commission. Absolutely inspired public administration techniques that take one's breath away in their capacity to not only define goals clearly, but to develop implementing programs that are faithful to the goals and to reassess those goals over time. South Africa's Competition Policy Tribunal does as well as any in the formulation and writing of opinions in this area, in the way in which the tribunal works, the speed with which it issues opinions, and the quality of analysis they bring to bear. And countries such as the Netherlands, which have been doing this for barely 10 years now, state-of-the-art pioneering developments in case management, especially in complex matters. In short, entry into this dimension of policymaking is relatively easy, it's broad-based, and you look about the entire globe today and you find exceptional talent to draw upon and particularly good products coming out of any number of jurisdictions. So if there was a tendency, and I think it's been diminishing for North Americans and citizens of the U.S. to think over time that by fact of being old and doing a lot of this, that one is better, that tendency has to be abandoned. It's simply not the case anymore. In short, one does not prevail in the policymaking world just by showing up. Superior performance is the only way to advance. As one famous athletic coach in the Washington area puts it this way, says, never confuse age or activity with accomplishment. That's good advice for a competition policy system today. What are the good applications? What do I mean by a good application? Well, the best applications typically involve achieving strong theoretical principles, but also some measure of experience to back them up. That was the case of the pre-merger notification regime in the United States, which was established in the mid-1970s and implemented in the late 70s. This is the mechanism that required firms contemplating mergers of a certain size to first notify the competition authorities and then to suspend the completion of the merger until the agencies had had some opportunity to examine the transaction and request more information about it. The U.S. system did not gain immediate acceptance. But over the course of 15 years or so of implementation, others observed it, they saw how it worked, and in a voluntary process began to opt in. So the applications that tend to be most impressive are those that are strong conceptually and have some actual experience to back them up. Now, these concepts can come in different directions. Some concepts will expand the zone of enforcement. Others will say that certain enforcement approaches require a rethink and should be retrenched. Others increase interoperability. Some simply improve the quality of the manner in which the agency actually goes about implementing its responsibilities. The implications of this path of development really are several. First, again, ease of entry into writing good applications takes place. And many existing applications have an open source quality to it. That is, you take an existing collection of merger guidelines and based upon your own analytical skill and experience, you can refine it and adapt it. And it means that irreversibly the sources of global influence are going to be truly global. There's a certain amount of disappointment and chagrin that I see sometimes in conferences where Americans say, when are we going to get back to the period of monopoly where we are unmistakably dominant? And everyone again looks adoringly at us and says, yes, thank you for your assistance. Those days are gone. And it shouldn't be surprising. The amount of intellectual DNA is distributed broadly across the globe. There's no specific designated market share that anyone gets, and it's not surprising that with a certain amount of formal training and actual experience that you would see particularly strong accomplishments. And that's hardly a bad thing to take place. It's a good thing for those of us in this field to see that developing over time. And by this foreshadows a comment I'll make, which is that the sources of U.S. influence and the nature of it irreversibly have changed. It also means that we do want to spend more time thinking about how we get good norms. We have the multiplicity of decision making, many jurisdictions with significant authority, making choices in this field that have tremendous cross-border effects. So we have a keen interest in seeing that the applications that were used, the approaches that are used, are the best possible. And this means that the way ahead is going to be through persuasion, not through fiat. If you're disappointed with what another agency has done, you can pout, you can yell at them, but at the end of those phases of childlike behavior, they still say, we're going to make our own choices here. You can persuade us, but there's no way that you can compel us to take a specific approach. It means that investments in activities that increase the persuasive influence of the agency, what I would call our research and development and innovation, that's going to be the jurisdiction that leads in the future. How much convergence do we want? Not complete. That is, if we had to wait until all 100+ jurisdictions agreed on a given course of action before changing direction, we would be passing up many opportunities for useful innovations. And to have a process that involves experimentation, some assessment, and adjustment by individual jurisdictions is probably the way to do it. Tim Muris identified this framework years ago. Tim taught contracts, still does. Tim used the experience with the Uniform Commercial Code in the United States. Broad decentralized experimentation. You had a group with no formal powers select from the collection of state activities what seemed to be superior techniques, and then the UCC was published in the 1950s. Was any individual state required to adopt it? No. It was completely aspirational, well-defined aspirations with very careful analysis, but did any state have to do it? No. But because it was a particularly good framework, what happened? Over the course of decades, everyone has one. Do they have variations? Of course. But it means now that if you're sitting in New York City or sitting in Cleveland and you want to make a transaction with someone in Los Angeles or in San Antonio, you're not going to be dealing with a shockingly different set of rules or standards for the sale of goods. It's had a remarkable influence, and Tim's view is this can work internationally too. And a good example of this process is the U.S. experience with amnesty or leniency to get firms to reveal cartels. This was the breakthrough insight of the Department of Justice in the 1990s, where under Ann Bigeman's leadership of the Department of Justice said there's a way to get people to come in, and that's to give them a nice prize for being first to snitch, and not to have particularly good prizes for second or third place. To have some prizes, but not really good ones. But a wonderful prize for first place. But it's not going to work unless the prize is compelling and that the prize is defined clearly and inevitably granted when the conditions are met. And what was the prize? No criminal sanctions. No individual liability. If you're first, your people don't go to prison. And that's a fairly powerful inducement. There was consternation inside the division and through the community. What do you mean to say that wrongdoers are going to be able to walk if they come in first? Better to have them walk than have everyone not walking at all, but sitting at their desks continuing to operate cartels. Nothing compelled other jurisdictions to do this. And there were frequently observations that, the culture in our country, it'll never work. In Japan, oh no, not in the cooperative framework where fidelity to the group is controlling. Oh no, not in Latin America. Oh no, not in the former Soviet Union, where there are terrible, terrible associations with the notion of informing or snitching. It simply can't work. It's been universally adopted. Very few jurisdictions have not adopted this framework or are considering in doing it. And in Japan, where some of the concerns were greatest, there was virtually a double line of applicants the day that the Japanese agency opened up for business with its leniency program. A perfect example of an experiment in the US, a testing process, others observed it and they voluntarily adopted it. And even short of having a mechanism where you have the identification and acceptance of practices universally, at a minimum what you want is what might be called in a computer sense interoperability. You want dissimilar systems to be able to talk to each other so you at least know what's taking place and you have a basis for a conversation that can lead to future progress in achieving agreement about what substantive norms should be. How's it affected the FTC basically in the last 20 years? This is the period when the FTC's international program really began to grow. When I was a junior case handler for the first time at the FTC in 1979, exactly 1/2 of one person's time was devoted to what might be called international relations. That was it. And the FTC at that time had 1,800 employees. 1/2 of one person's time, who basically worked as a concierge to make sure that when there was some international meeting, people went. Our Office of International Affairs today is 25, and that's what they do. And it reflects the significance of this role over time. I think what the Commission has come to realize that, again, in order to design the mechanisms that become compelling examples, the software that will run on the operating system, the applications, requires a greater investment in coming up with the ideas that people find compelling. We're engaged with the Department of Justice now in a process of rewriting our own horizontal merger guidelines. They're not only going to be important as an upgrade to our own system, but one of the things that makes us anxious and excited about the process is the effort to come up with something that's better than anyone else has. This is part of the mostly friendly competition that takes place internationally. And we will have achieved success if others read this, maybe with a little bit of envy, and say, that's the leader in the clubhouse. That's the best job. And it will be by that process of policy elaboration that others say, that's something worth thinking about and emulating. But it only comes from making a commitment to invest in the creation of the ideas and not simply enforcement. Because how are most public officials measured? You are whom you sue. And counts are taken. How many cases? If you go to a bar association meeting and start to talk about these topics, you start to see the back of the sports section because people are starting to read something else. Or you see them nervously going through the program to see if there's a parallel session. And if you don't have guards at the doors, they start to leave faster than if you yelled fire in the auditorium. Yet, these kinds of investments become the basis on which the larger international framework is influenced. It requires more effort to build networks across borders, to reflect on one's own experience, and to spend more money on technical assistance in the work that we do with relatively new regimes. And indeed, and quite crucially for the US, because many of the good ideas are overseas now, is to benchmark what we're doing side by side with what our counterparts are doing. Because in many ways, though I'm quite proud of what the US agencies have done and how they operate in many respects, we're simply not the best in a number of key respects, and there's a lot we can learn from our counterparts overseas. So you lead by persuasion in this new area by having the better idea. It means spending funds consciously on building the basis of knowledge in the agency, both with respect to broad concepts but the reflection on applied work. It involves playing more and more the role of a convener where you bring in those in your own jurisdiction or others to think about things. This is a powerful advantage for the United States. That is, if you looked across the world and you asked, where is the leading concentration of skills in the fields of industrial organization, economics at the graduate level, and in legal education, it's in North America, without a doubt. And a number of you may have had the occasion to sit through a law school lecture in many other countries, and what happens? The great man or woman opens up the folder, pulls out the sheets of paper, and reads. And when the clock swings around to its appointed close, the folder is closed, the great person picks up the folder and leaves. And those who study in our LLM programs and come to the law school classrooms in North America see a refreshing and different pedagogical process. Indeed, many of the LLM students I recall in the US are quite startled when someone will tell the great figure at the front of the room, "You're wrong. I disagree. How could you talk back to God that way? There's no interaction. What do you mean you're wrong?" But that happens as a natural process of the give and take in the typical US law school or in the graduate school program. So a natural implication of this is that since this is a powerful advantage to us, if we're to achieve these kinds of advances in knowledge and reflected in our work, having a closer partnership with these institutions is critical. And I've listed here several of the kinds of idea-building activities that we've tried to engage in order to accomplish this integration of conceptual knowledge, our own experience, and building the base on which we make policy. It means building formal relationships, again, with academic research centers. We've developed a program with Northwestern. Northwestern has a superb cluster that consists of an excellent law school, a truly superior economics department, and a genuinely first-rate business school. And what we're trying to do on a regular basis is develop an approach where we tell them about what interests us and they tell us about what they're doing. And the idea is that by reaching out to these institutions, we will recruit better and we'll also have a better capacity to learn about ideas that develop as they emerge and to influence researchers to look at more things of interest to us. It also means that we're spending more time building cross-border networks. It's just about 10 years ago, next year, that the International Competition Network was created. This was 14 people at a stage at Fordham Law School in New York, announcing that they were going to build a new network of competition agencies. Today, the ICN has 100 members. And when you go to the annual meeting, which is the convening point, and you look about the room and see all of the flags by the individual chairs, again, you see the constellation of participation that my instructor in 1970 could never have imagined, and Professor Heilbronner most certainly did not imagine. They're all there. OECD, NAFTA, bilateral relationships. What do these activities do? Well, they build a deeper knowledge of individual systems, which is where you begin. There is a danger that if you go to the occasional seminar and you read the occasional article, you begin to think you know a lot more about other regimes than you actually do. You acquire a superficial familiarity with the vocabulary. But those of us who live in North America who've been struggling just to understand what happens in the United States, what our courts do and why they do it, how the law changes, what our legislature is seeking to accomplish, what accounts for these developments in the culture in which, when you look at the United States and you travel end to end, north to south, you begin to wonder how these all became part of the same jurisdiction, since in so many ways they have little in common, but there are key features that do link them together. That kind of deeper understanding of how a system develops becomes critical in forming judgments about where you can go about beginning to build common links with respect to concepts or operations. And what is taking place in this instance is the creation of a culture of trust. We spend lots of time in the modern era working with our colleagues in the anti-monopoly system of the People's Republic of China. 3 agencies. I don't know if they studied the U.S. experience, but they have 3, not simply 2, at the national level. And a key element of this process, yes, involves the technical discussions of concepts. But what's happening most fundamentally is the creation of trust that happens face-to-face in a discussion of different systems. Because there's an ambivalence, I'm sure, about what the U.S. agencies and its government are seeking to do. On one half of the brain, there is a sense, yes, you've got a lot of experience. I'd love to have the benefit of that. But on the other hand, there is a concern that maybe you're not offering your assistance simply for motives that are benign. And it is only through a long process of discussion, analysis, common work, that an element of trust is developed that increases understanding and finally promotes the process of going from very informal and limited contexts to more formal and elaborate contexts and cooperation on individual matters, as well as joint efforts to evaluate how things are going both in individual jurisdictions and across them. And looking at how institutional innovations, and I mentioned DG Competition's chief economist team here, how institutional innovations are improving operational performance. But these networks can't be built on the cheap. They require intensive effort at high levels of the agency as well as middle management and down into the professional staff. This can't be done cheaply, and again, it never shows up on the competition policy scorecard. These aren't cases. These aren't individual observable enforcement events. These are the roads. This is the infrastructure. And if you don't build the high-quality infrastructure, you don't get good policy. And I mentioned earlier today at the faculty workshop, one of my colleagues is fond of saying that if you want broadband quality policy results, you can't do it with dial-up institutions. And to have the broadband institutions requires a major investment of effort before you generate the case. But if the case is all that matters, who's going to build the roads? Because those are long-term capital assets that require dedicated effort across individual presidential administrations. In many ways, I think what we're seeking to do is to spend more time looking at our own experience. I think the agency that's going to prosper is the one that undergoes independent internal periodic reviews. Not because some blue ribbon panel puts a gun to the head and says you've got to evaluate what you're doing, but instead develops an internal ethic of realizing that it is in basically a race to achieve superior performance, and it can only do that through a critical self-assessment process. And this includes the evaluation of how things have turned out. You can't imagine a hospital that would perform surgery, wheel the patient out the door, put it in the ambulance to go home and say, "You're done." The patient says, "When do I see you again?" You say, "Never. You're okay. Got a press release, says so. We looked at your merger. We operated. You're in good shape forever. Don't come back." You wouldn't do it in the practice of medicine. You can't do it in competition policy. So that the agency that does the internal evaluation discloses databases about what it's doing and pays close attention to the assessment, the growth of its own human capital is going to prosper. And again, this is where state-of-the-art agencies are recruiting globally, not just for managers and line officials, but also for top agency leadership. The head of the United Kingdom's Office of Fair Trading is a citizen of Ireland, not a citizen of the United Kingdom. Born and bred in Dublin, not in London. And more agencies are looking across the entire range of possibilities to do hiring in this area. More outlays for formal liaison experience. I mentioned technical assistance. One of the best pieces of legislation in recent years at the FTC is a thing that goes by the acronym of SafeWeb. It deals a lot with information sharing across borders, but one of the best features of it is that it allows us formally to do exchange programs with other agencies for competition and consumer protection. And at any one time in our building now, we have citizens of other competition authorities numbering 5 to 15 at any one moment. What's good about this? This is how you learn about the other system. This is how you not only transfer technical know-how, but this is how you go about establishing the kinds of understandings that really create more than the superficial awareness of how individual agencies operate. We've had resident advisors spending 4, 5, 6 months, a year or more in places such as Budapest, in Pretoria, in Jakarta, in Hanoi, doing work with our counterparts overseas, and promoting the development, again, of common teaching programs that leads to understanding, trust, and consensus building. I'll finish with a final challenge that I think is going to be important to building good programs, and that's coherence at home. Who converges on what? What do we have in the United States? Well, we have 2 federal antitrust agencies. We have federal sectoral regulators that look at mergers in areas such as electric power and communications. Our state attorneys general can enforce their laws without regard to what the federal officials do. The states have sectoral regulators called public utility commissions, and we have private rights of action that are absolutely unsurpassed. The rest of the world looks at this and says, can this possibly be the best equilibrium? I spent time working in the Ukraine in the previous decade with their competition agency, and foreign officials, especially in relatively new regimes, do their homework about the U.S. They study voraciously, they read, and they pose questions. And they're very hesitant to question what's happening because the assumption is, after all, you've been doing this for over a century, you must have gotten it right. And she said, I just want to understand how you look at mergers in telecommunications. I said, fine. She said, you have your Ministry of Justice looks at telecommunications mergers. I says, yes, Department of Justice, that's right. And your sectoral regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, they also look at the same merger and impose conditions without regard necessarily to what the Department of Justice did. I said they coordinate, but yes, that's right. And regardless of what the federal regulators do, your state ministries of justice also can look at these transactions. I said, that's right. And they can impose conditions that go beyond what the federal regulators do. I said, that's right. And in the states in which those firms do business, the public utility commissions also look at those mergers and impose conditions. I said, that's right. And if none of the public officials act, you have private rights of action and some limited ability of private parties, customers, competitors, suppliers, also to challenge the transaction. I said, "That's right." She posed for a second and was very hesitant with the next question, and she said, "Isn't that irrational?" I said, "That's right." And a great challenge for the United States is to think, are we happy with this arrangement forever? Because how do we provide a coherent view to the rest of the world if we haven't even achieved it internally? My agency spends more time discussing merger review and best practices with our European counterparts than we do with the Department of Justice, which is 2 blocks away. More than we do with state governments, more than we do with the sectoral regulators. And if we're not going to achieve integration by ownership, that is to collapse these functions into individual authorities, you can do it by contract, and we don't do nearly enough of that as well. And we can say this is path dependent and we can't touch it, and we may choose to do that, but the rest of the world is making choices to rethink this. In the last 5 years, Spain, Portugal, and France have taken 2 competition authorities and created 1. Brazil is on the cusp of taking its 3 competition authorities and creating 1. Something's going on here in evaluating the basic structure and effectiveness of enforcement, and I fear that to some extent we're missing an important game. In 2008, we did a fairly elaborate assessment of where we are, benchmarking ourselves with other agencies. And the punchline of this exercise called FTC at 100 was to see clearly that other jurisdictions in some ways are taking the institutional framework more seriously than we are. They're not coming up with perfect answers, but they're asking the questions in the right way. And they're trying harder to come up with a framework that works well. This, by the way, will be a source of significant economic national advantage for jurisdictions that do better than others. So where are we going ahead? Shared influence. We won't be, nor should we be, the leader in all areas. Unattainable, undesirable, and in light of the broad pool of talent, simply not a realistic expectation. But it means to achieve the convergence on superior norms, greater interoperability, more investment in collaborative networks, and you shape norms through intellectual leadership. And this involves redefining what a good agency should do, not measured just by how many cases it pushes out the door, but how much it invests in this kind of infrastructure development. So the future in the shared world of responsibility is by persuasion, it's not by unilateral choice, and by ideas and marshaling experience in an effective way. But the key to it, and this is the Achilles heel of the U.S. system, where political appointees, that's me, tend to look at shorter-term goals and investments that yield appropriable outcomes in the term of one's own appointment. And that comes at the expense of longer-term capital outlays, the roads and infrastructure of the system, where there's a concern about making the investment because you know you won't be there when the ribbon-cutting ceremony opens up the bridge or the road. But those are exactly the kinds of investments that have to be made in this world of multiplicity going ahead. And to some extent, I've called this the mostly friendly rivalry. And in many ways, our relationships with our counterparts overseas are mostly friendly. But there is an element of rivalry to come up with the best model. And if the rivalry is focused on coming up with the better analytical technique, the better organizational model, that's a competition worth having. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. When you're called on for a question, please wait a moment until one of the students with the microphone reaches you, because this is being webcast and recorded, and we'd like to capture the question as well. Yes, sir.
You were talking about the M&A, that's merger and acquisition activity, and you're probably aware that in Cleveland we have the best M&A law firm in the United States. Probably most people know the name of it. There's somebody.
If we're talking about the same law firm, that's an incredible law firm.
Yeah, there's someone to my left who's probably heard of it.
And
Have
some
you
of
ever
it's
heard of it?
And it's antitrust lawyers, I can attest, are especially skilled, and I know one in particular, even more than him, who's a real champion in the field.
The point I'm not trying just to,
It's my wife.
I'm not trying just to, give him a compliment. The point I'm trying to make is that we have some in Cleveland. No, it's not my opinion that Jones Day is the best M&A lawyers in the United States. That's published in many places. They're good in a lot of areas, but in M&A they're rated tops. In that area, you're talking about you've talked about a lot of issues, but you haven't really talked about what result in terms of how do we make progress, because you're talking about short-term goals that you don't have any real good answers for. Have you tried to work with people like Jones Day who have a little bit of success in M&A? And they also have now quite a bit of lawyers in countries other than the United States. You could ask somebody to my left here. I think he's a little more knowledgeable than I. In fact, I know he is. I mean, I just know what I read in the paper. He knows a tad more, I would think. But I'd like you to comment on that, because Jones Day is in Cleveland, and you talk about all these people are like running right past us, like we're, like we're not doing anything right. And I think there are people in the United States who are doing things right, and we, it rubs me the wrong way that like everybody's running right past us with all this stuff. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, but I don't buy it.
I wouldn't say everyone's running past us. I'd say they're running alongside of us. And I would add that a number of things that the U.S. Community is doing are enormously useful and effective. In this line here, I have a couple of these cross-border networks. The International Competition Network, which I mentioned before, which is now almost 10, is a good example where the kind of investment that I had mentioned has yielded great results. And it's yielded great results not just because of the commitment from the agencies, but because of non-government advisors, which have included some of the very best academicians and practitioners in North America. And what have been the results of this? They've had remarkable success in doing three things. One is building a consensus about what seems to be a better technique, distilling that into specific recommendations, and then encouraging countries to opt into those. And that's one example of how this kind of investment, done patiently and in a significant way, can yield tremendous benefits. And it has worked because it's involved exactly the synthesis of effort, private sector, public sector, academia, just to add a third that you were referring to before. So it is far from an unremittingly gloomy picture. We're not in last place by any means. In a number of product categories, we're still the best in class, but none of that can be taken for granted.
This is a whole new field for me. I don't deal in this, so maybe my question's dumb. What kind of synergy, if any, is there between all of the things that you've talked about in the national and international financial markets?
One of the issues, among the issues in those markets, are how could you have gotten better regulatory results if there had been more common discussion across borders of specific phenomena? Within the United States, could you have gotten better results where instead of having 6 or 7 federal agencies, each with a piece of the financial services portfolio, you'd had at least through interagency cooperation, more effective pooling of effort? In this archipelago of regulatory authority, would you have had perhaps better results if you'd had better ferry service between the islands. And when it comes to larger international discussions about what global norms should be, and you're aware of the nature of that debate today, this kind of investment in building relationships in that regulatory regime is every bit as important to making the system effective as it is here, maybe even more important. So this is, these questions, I think, pervade one area of regulatory intervention after another.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there, but before we end, there will be a reception on the other side of this wall, and Commissioner Kovacic will be there as well if you have additional questions. Also, just like to say, we have a small gift, a small token of our appreciation. I hope it falls within the relevant ethical guidelines of the Commission.
Under that famous $25 per gift and no more than $50 per year limit. Thank you.
But again, please join me again for thanks.